In 1964, a man sold sneakers out of the back of his car. No store, no staff, no brand, really. Not yet. Just a guy, a green Plymouth Valiant, and a trunk full of shoes he'd shipped over from Japan. Here's the strange part. That car trunk would eventually grow into a company worth over $150 billion. A company whose logo is tattooed on people's skin. A company that dresses Olympic champions and sits in almost every closet on the planet.
So how does a guy selling shoes at high school track meets become that? Stick with this one, because the real answer isn't hustle, and it isn't luck. It starts with a college paper nobody expected to matter, and a lie that somehow turned out to be true. Let's rewind. Phil Knight wasn't a shoe designer. He wasn't a marketing genius. Not yet, anyway. He was a middle-distance runner at the University of Oregon. A decent one. Good enough to know something most people didn't.
American running shoes back then were bad, heavy, stiff, overpriced, and built more like work boots than racing equipment. Meanwhile, Japanese camera makers had spent the past decade proving something surprising, that they could out-engineer German optics and do it for a fraction of the cost. Knight had a question, a simple one. What if someone did that with running shoes? That question became his graduate thesis at Stanford Business School. A paper, an assignment, the kind of thing most students finish, hand in, and forget by summer.
Knight didn't forget it. In 1962, he got on a plane to Japan with almost no plan and even less money. He walked into the offices of a shoe company called Onitsuka Tiger and introduced himself as the president of an American distribution company. That company did not exist. He made it up, on the spot. And they believed him. The first deal that eventually built Nike was closed by a 24-year-old bluffing his way through a business meeting, representing a company that at that point existed only in his head. But here's what actually made it work. Onitsuka agreed to send him sample shoes, and when those samples landed in Oregon, Knight didn't rent a warehouse, he didn't hire a sales team, he didn't even really have an office. He put the boxes in his car. For the next several years, Phil Knight drove up and down the West Coast to track meets, popped his trunk, and sold shoes directly to runners and coaches. One pair, one conversation, one relationship at a time. His old college coach, Bill Bowerman, became his partner. Bowerman had spent years tinkering with rubber soles in his garage, trying to shave fractions of an ounce off every shoe, convinced that lighter meant faster. Together, they scraped together $500 each, $650 total, and named the company Blue Ribbon Sports. No office, no factory, just a car, a garage, and a bet that quality would eventually speak louder than a name nobody had heard of. And then, almost nothing about it was stable. Blue Ribbon Sports nearly died more than once. Banks pulled credit lines without warning. Suppliers in Japan demanded full payment before shipments had even landed on American soil. At one point, Knight was personally exposed to debts large enough to wipe out everything he owned. A man who had once bluffed his way into a shoe deal, now genuinely close to losing everything that bluff had built.
This wasn't a smooth rise. This was survival, year after year, one cash crisis at a time. The kind of story that never makes it into the highlight reel.
Even Bowerman's most famous contribution nearly went unnoticed. One morning in the early 1970s, he poured liquid rubber into his wife's waffle iron just to see what would happen. What came out was a strange, gridded sole pattern, light, grippy, completely unlike anything on the market. It became the foundation for one of the company's first real breakthrough shoes.
Small experiments, kitchen appliances, a man who cared more about shaving a second off a mile time than he did about ruining his own waffle iron. That's what was actually behind the science of innovation in those early years. Not a lab, a garage. By 1971, the relationship with Onitsuka had soured completely. Knight needed his own brand, his own name, separate from the Japanese company that had given him his start, but now felt more like a leash than a partner.
A graphic design student named Carolyn Davidson was working part-time nearby. Knight asked her to come up with a logo. He paid her $35. She sketched a shape meant to suggest motion, a swoosh, a wing, a wisp of speed caught mid-stride. Knight's reaction, by most accounts, was lukewarm. "I don't love it," he reportedly said, "but it'll grow on me." Sit with that for a second. The single most recognized brand symbol on Earth, stitched into shoes on every continent, almost wasn't good enough for the man who approved it.
Now think about that, because this isn't really a story about shoes. It's a story about almost everyone who's ever tried to build something real. The idea that starts as a school assignment nobody takes seriously. The bluff you have to make because you don't yet have the credentials to back it up. The years spent doing something small and unglamorous, selling out of a car, tinkering in a garage, because the alternative is doing nothing at all. Most people quietly stop before the version that actually works shows up. Knight didn't stop. Not because he had certainty. He didn't. He had almost none of it. He kept going through years when the whole company could have folded on any given Tuesday. That's the part the swoosh doesn't tell you. Behind that clean, confident little mark is a decade of doubt, debt, and a waffle iron nobody was supposed to ruin. Growth like that doesn't arrive quietly, though.
Through the late 70s, Nike was chasing a giant. Adidas had decades of history, deep roots in Europe, and a reputation Blue Ribbon Sports couldn't buy at any price. So Knight leaned into the one thing Adidas didn't have: American athletes willing to gamble on an unproven brand. Distance runner Steve Prefontaine became one of the earliest faces of the company, not because Nike could pay him what the big names paid, but because he believed in the product before the rest of the country did. That kind of early belief is hard to manufacture. You either have it, or you're still waiting for it. By 1978, the company had a new name, Nike, after the Greek goddess of victory, and revenue had climbed past $100 million. The trunk of the Plymouth Valiant was long gone. In its place, factories, sponsored athletes, a growing global supply chain, and a symbol that by then needed no words at all. Within a decade, that symbol would be on the shoes of a young basketball player named Michael Jordan, and the company that once sold sneakers out of a car would be shaping how the entire world thought about sport, style, and status. There's a version of this story where Phil Knight never gets on that plane, where the thesis stays a thesis, filed away and forgotten, where the shoes stay in the trunk, unsold, and the whole thing quietly disappears somewhere outside Portland. That version almost happened, more than once. What survived instead is a reminder, not a triumphant one, just a true one, that the biggest names usually start as the smallest, shakiest bets. A car, a garage, $35 for a logo nobody was fully sure about. Somewhere between a Stanford classroom and a waffle iron in Oregon, an idea that could have died 100 quiet deaths kept finding one more person willing to carry it forward. That's usually how it happens, not with certainty, with one more step, taken anyway. If you found this story valuable, the real, unpolished beginnings behind a name you already know, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, waiting quietly behind the brands we think we already understand.